to the introductory video on the Policy Author's Guide at Office of Children and Family Services, better known as OCFS. I am Precious Rio of the OCFS Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, ODEIA.
And I'm Tom Brooks of the OCFS Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Development, SPPD. The Policy Author's Guide is a product of the Policy Review and Data Analysis Subcommittee, PRADA, with the support of ODEIA and SPPD. The PRADA subcommittee includes staff from many parts of OCFS and supports OCFS's agency-wide commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which we will refer to throughout this video as DEIA.
Subcommittee seeks to promote an equity lens throughout the policy process and supports the delivery of effective programs and services by integrating diversity and inclusion principles into data analysis, program planning, and evaluation processes and practices. Before we dive into the importance of equity in the policy process, let's listen to a message from our acting commissioner.
As the Acting Commissioner of the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, I am very proud to introduce the first edition of OCFS's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Policy Author's Guide. Now, this is not a standard, ordinary guide. Begun in 2020 under the leadership of former Commissioner Sheila J. Poole, this guide is the culmination of years of resolute, forward-thinking, and commitment to ensuring OCFS leads with equity in human services, and that we review, prepare, and examine our policies with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as a foundational principle. I'm referring to all policies, from child care to child welfare, to vision loss, to juvenile justice, and equally importantly, our own internal workplace operations. We know that as an executive state agency, we have immense power and influence over children, families, and communities across New York State. And we take our responsibilities very, very seriously. Our policies have the power to do great good for the communities we serve, but also the power to do harm, especially if they are not developed with a deliberate and intentional focus on equity. And our systems have indeed done great harm in the past when we haven't prioritized and intentionally focused on that equity. It is necessary for our agency to accept accountability and proactively implement processes that are anti-racist and anti-oppressive. To truly repair past harms and build trust between the government and our communities, we must continuously assess the impact our policies have and have had, and we must engage with our communities and our partners during the policy planning process. This invaluable new Policy Author's Guide walks us step by step through best practices and the process of developing a policy with equity and inclusion as our North Star. The Policy Author's Guide uses a multi-layered, multidisciplinary, and holistic approach. This approach requires policymakers to meaningfully engage with focus groups, gain input from collaborators and partners, conduct data analysis, incorporate practices from tribal nations, and ensure that policies are crafted to be accessible and universal in design. When operations and decision-making are not led with equity, the results can perpetuate systemic inequities, disparities, and harm. Tools like this guide provide a structure for action and a roadmap for the practice of institutionalizing equity into policy development. This is our opportunity to begin to operationalize equity. I am very proud of our efforts. This first edition of the Policy Author's Guide is an introduction for OCFS policymakers and decision makers to an equity-led approach that we intend to implement in the development of every OCFS policy. We are rolling out this guide as a first step toward a future where every OCFS policy is reviewed or drafted with an explicit and intentional equity framework. A hearty thank you to all the individuals whose time and expertise contributed to developing this important resource guide, and especially to the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Development, the PRADA Subcommittee, and the Public Information Office. We can't wait to hear what you think.
Thank you, Acting Commissioner. In this video, we will learn about the agency's DEIA-informed policy development process, strategies, and successes. Equity in policy. We'll have a brief introduction to the Policy Authors Guide, reviewing parts 1 and 2 of the guide, and we'll point to resources that will help with your overall understanding of the guide and equity in policy.
DEIA-informed policy development. The ODEIA has created and is implementing a 5-year strategic plan under the supervision of the Office of Inclusion Management at Civil Service. There are 4 main objectives required by state agencies to consider during the implementation of their DEI plans. The 4 objectives created by Civil Service are: 1, the development of strategic leaders; 2, the recruitment and retention of diverse talent; 3, to create and sustain an inclusive workplace; and 4, provide effective programs and services. OCFS has added a 5th objective that we believe is equally important and perceives the need for the Policy Authors Guide. That objective is ensuring our policies and practices are equitable.
At OCFS, it is important that policies and programs are effective and developed with and prioritize a DEIA lens from their inception. Policy teams must remain proactive rather than reactive in all phases of the policy process. Is the policy equitable? Were diverse backgrounds and input included during the formation? Was inclusion a priority? Were any accessibility concerns addressed? These are just a handful of questions policy teams should consider, and that this Policy Authors Guide attempts to address.
There are several practices that policy teams should implement to ensure that these questions are addressed. Policy teams should understand the differences between equity and equality. Equity goes beyond race and gender and includes several other classifications, such as sexual orientation and ability status. Please review our DEIA glossary and additional resources on DEIA best practices, which can be found in the resource section of the Policy Authors Guide. Policies should address decisions that are based on research. This means evidence-based, peer-reviewed, and verified sources of input. One way DEIA-informed policy development occurs is with the help of authentic voices and those with lived experiences. There should always be accountability for policies and practices that have created a disparate impact on specific groups. Accountability can look like evidence-informed practices, because policy authors should be aware that evidence-based or peer-reviewed may limit understanding and implementation, depending on who is conducting the research. OCFS and DEIA-informed policy development. With the creation of the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, OCFS has taken an equity-focused approach to our policy process. We have added the A in DEIA to account for the intersectionality of accessibility and equity. It is important to recognize and adapt our policies and programs for various points of identity of the communities we serve. OCFS has also created several practice models across the agency to further advance this mission, participated in equity policy reviews, and currently releases new episodes in podcast format to highlight and maintain visibility for systemically marginalized groups. We seek to continue other educational opportunities and showcase events that highlight diversity and inclusion with an equitable lens. 2, equity in policy. In this portion of the introductory video, we will discuss the importance of equity in policy. OCFS seeks to prioritize dismantling oppressive systems of inequity in the delivery of our programs and services. This policy guide seeks to connect the equity work with the formation of these programs and services. OCFS and the Policy Authors Guide seek to center historically underrepresented and systemically marginalized groups of people by using an intersectional framework to uplift those exact voices. Intersectionality refers to the term coined in 1989 by civil rights activist and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw that describes the unique types of oppression and discrimination experienced by individuals with multiple marginalized identities in categories such as gender, identity, race, class, ability, or sexual orientation. These overlapping systems of oppression interact and contribute to multiple forms of discrimination and systematic social inequality. Intersectional frameworks are all around us and enrich the policy process the best when used as a tool during the formation, implementation, and evaluation of policies and programs.
3, Introduction to the DEIA Policy Authors Guide. The guide consists of 2 parts. Part 1, DEIA-informed policy development, and Part 2, the Document Review Management System, better known as DRMS, Equity Tracker. Part 1 of the guide focuses on introducing policy teams to DEIA-informed policy development. Additionally, policy teams are introduced to policy resources, how-to documents, tip sheets that indicate best practices, and educational briefings that allow for policy-led learning and evaluation.
It is important to note that this guide is not all-encompassing. In fact, it exists within the silos of government-led policy directives and procedures. This means the Policy Authors Guide operates within a government institution that has its own limitations. This guide, when used properly, will propel policy teams and policy advocates to build upon its foundational work and address how the policy process can better assist everyone.
Next, we will conduct an overview of the content in parts 1 and 2 of the guide. We will also spend time reviewing the questions within part 2 of the guide that make up the equity tracker. As a reminder, this video is an introduction to the guide itself, A more in-depth training series will be provided for policy teams within the agency.
Part 1, Policy Author's Guide. Part 1 consists of DEIA policy-informed development and why it should concern us, as well as resources, tip sheets, and educational briefs. There are several tip sheets: cultural competence / cultural humility, focus groups, stakeholders, and 2 data analysis resources, followed by best practices as it relates to the SOGI of a person. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity / expression. Additionally, there is a tribal nations educational brief and community guidelines regarding accessibility. We will briefly discuss all 7 of these resources. Cultural competence and cultural humility. As an agency, our goal in the delivery of our programs and services is cultural humility. We recognize that some individuals are beginning their journey at cultural competence. Cultural competence is the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures and belief systems different from one's own origin or current paradigm of culture, as noted by the American Psychological Association. Cultural humility is the ability to maintain that stance of respect, honor, and curiosity about culture that is important to the individuals you are working with. This is a lifelong process.
Focus groups. Focus groups are a kind of research method used in qualitative research. Focus groups exist as a means of gathering empirical information from various groups of individuals who discuss a set-upon topic, or in this case, a set-upon policy, program, or directive. A few items policy teams should consider when working with focus groups are ethics, the location and environment of the focus group, ensuring accessibility, and incentives.
Stakeholders. Stakeholders play a vital role in the policy process. Stakeholders can be internal or external, individuals and/or groups. They are different from focus groups. They assist policy teams with critical knowledge prior to the policy and during the implementation phases.
Data analysis. There are 2 tip sheets associated with data analysis in this policy author's guide. These tip sheets are geared toward DEIA-related questions during the development of a policy, as well as an introduction to quantitative and qualitative analysis. These are 2 types of research methods used in analyzing data.
SOGI best practices. This tip sheet provides a baseline expectation of working with LGBTQAI+ individuals in which policy teams must consider the intersection of each identity of the communities we serve. When we stop to consider how proposed policy changes affect an individual's SOGI, we are joining the national conversation in best practices for well-being and inclusion.
Tribal Nations Educational Brief. The following educational brief was included to promote visibility and inclusivity while engaging with tribal nations.
Tribal nations are not just a people group, but they also encompass a distinct way of life that includes various governing groups, intertwining the spiritual and political. It is crucial that policy teams take this into account when developing new policies and revising existing policies or programs that affect tribal nations. This resource was developed by and in partnership with OCFS Office of Native American Services, their partners, and the Office of DEIA. There are several considerations to ensure communication, policies, and programs are beneficial and are compliant for tribal nations. Within the guide, there is also a non-exhaustive list of resources attached to this educational brief for policy teams to further consider.
Accessibility Community Guidelines. This tip sheet was included and created by individuals within the differently abled community. It serves as an introduction to accessibility within written documents from the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, perspective. There are resources policy teams may access to further assist their understanding of accessibility in documents.
Now we will review part 2 of the Policy Author's Guide, the DRMS Equity Impact Questions.
The purpose of part 2 is to empower and enable policy authors to meaningfully note and report on the steps their division took to develop a policy or regulation with DEIA at its core. Through utilization of the DRMS Equity Impact Tracker, OCFS staff will practice and develop an understanding of how to ensure that DEIA is at the center of all agency policy processes.
Question 1, clarifying the purpose. This question requires the policy author or team to consider what the purpose is for the policy or regulation being considered. Authors should identify what the policy or regulation is intended to accomplish at the implementation level. A few questions the policy team may ask are, is the policy or regulation being developed to address a previously identified issue of inequity? How will OCFS measure whether the policy is effective? Consider using the acronym SMARTY: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. The author should also review existing materials and policies related to the proposed policy.
Question 2, diversity of team proposing action. This question asks the policy team to identify whether the internal or external team that is proposing the policy or regulation is diverse. This is separate from focus groups or stakeholder engagement. This question specifically refers to the creation of the policy team before the drafting and implementation stages. The goal is to create a diverse team prior to the development of any policy, as this can enhance decision-making and problem-solving. Question 3, examining the causes. This question requires the policy author to examine what factors may be causing and/or perpetuating inequities associated with the issue that the policy or regulation is meant to address. It also requires a line of questioning for the policy teams. Some questions the team may consider are, is the policy or regulation sufficient to address issues of inequity? Or are those issues beyond the scope of the policy or regulation being developed? Are there other measures that might enhance the effectiveness of the policy or regulation in addressing inequities?
Question 4, engaging stakeholders. OCFS would like to note, we are aware of the weighted and discriminatory practices associated with the term stakeholders. We acknowledge the harm to our Indigenous communities related to who traditionally had a stake in power and decision-making versus who did not. This series of questions requires authors to identify which groups might be most affected by and/or concerned with the issues related to the proposed policy or regulation. Authors should be able to state which stakeholders were identified based on the intent and content of the proposed policy or regulation. At minimum, this means informing them of the proposed policy or regulation and asking for feedback. Efforts to engage stakeholders can also take the form of focus groups or active roles in suggesting content for the proposed policy or regulation. It is important to note that individuals with lived experiences can offer robust solutions and feedback to specific policies. Question 5, advancing equitable impacts. This question asks the author to consider whether the policy might have positive impacts on equity or inclusion. It asks which group could benefit from the proposed policy or regulation. Are there ways to maximize this benefit or to make it transferable across groups? Would implementation of the policy or regulation mitigate inequities experienced by stakeholders? It is important to note context. What may be beneficial to you may be, in part, harmful to different individuals.
Question 6, considering adverse impacts. This question asks policy teams to consider which individuals or communities may be negatively affected by the proposal. Additionally, if this policy or regulation may adversely impact a particular community, was there representation from the affected community, stakeholders or others, in the development of the policy? The author should be able to identify how those impacts could be minimized and how to think about including communities affected in the creation of the proposal or policy in appropriate ways. Question 7, identifying success indicators. Success indicators include both process measures to measure implementation progress and outcome measures to measure impact. Key performance indicators, known as KPIs, focus on outcome measures that explain the impact of the policy at different stages of implementation. It is important to note that having a specific data collection plan will be useful for measuring efficacy and success.
Lastly, question 8, feedback. This last item is more of a suggested requirement than a question. Feedback on this guide is essential to the formation of the next generation of it. The policy author's guide will remain a living document, meaning the product subcommittee, ODEIA and SPPD are open to suggestions, comments, and concerns to assist in future adaptations. This slide concludes our introduction of Part 2 of the guide.
Several resources will accompany the guide. Resources such as a DEIA glossary of terms, an online resource library, the DEIA practice model, and contact information.
All resources provided are employee-found and verified through the offices of DEIA and SPPD and the product subcommittee. If you would like to contribute to any of these items, please use the contact information at the end of this slideshow. We would like to thank you for your time in watching this introductory video. Any questions and/or comments may be sent to ocfs.fm.deia@ocfs.ny.gov.